day 3. No alcohol for me here. And today's been kind of tough. You know, I had a decent day with my wife and little boy, and it was really fun celebrating Christmas with him. We're living in a really rural place now. You know, we got a couple really dear friends out here, but other than that, we don't know anybody. That's all right though. It's a good change of pace from where we were in California. It seems like day 4 always is a big relapse day. There's been countless times I've made it to the 4th day. There's something about cracking on the 4th day. And today I'm having a lot of emotions come up. I'm having a lot of painful memories come up, and that's probably why I start drinking again on the 4th day. Alcohol for me, it's not just about stopping for the sake of stopping, health purposes, whatever. It has a really deep thorn in my side and my soul because it essentially killed my father. Alcoholism killed my father. It greatly affected our relationship. I didn't get to know him until I was 22. My mother divorced him when I was very young, like within a couple months of me being born, because he was a raging alcoholic and he couldn't stop. Now, granted, to his credit, after she left him and took me, he got sober. He got sober and he stayed sober for nearly 20 years. He got involved in the whole AA thing and got community and support. Me and my mom, you know, we were in Arizona. I grew up in Arizona. He moved out to California, and even though he got sober, he wasn't in the picture. It has had a profound effect on me. And so when I essentially met him, you know, when I started to really get to know him, you know, there was a couple times I saw him when I was a little kid. He kind of popped in again when I was like 13, but it was 22. I went and met him at the Sunlight Cafe in Seattle off of 65th and Roosevelt. And I was in the early grips of my heroin addiction. I was 22. I was strung out on black tar heroin in Seattle and still in denial of where I was at. I hadn't fully accepted the gravity of my situation. So I went and met my dad. It was the first time I'd seen him in nearly 10 years. I'm strung out on heroin, and I was getting kicked out of my roommate situation. I was living in this house with a bunch of roommates by Roosevelt High School. It was a party house. I introduced most of them to heroin. I had a girlfriend that was doing heroin with me. My whole world became heroin. That's kind of what it tends to do. But this was when, in the early stages, when it was still deceiving, and it seemed like, oh, maybe we kind of have a handle on this. So it struck me when I met him that he ordered a beer with his lunch. I was like, I thought he'd been sober for a very long time. Oh, he was in the tech industry. He was a very smart man. You know, he worked for F5, Microsoft, Intel. When I met him, he was living off of some stock money he'd acquired. He had a collection of 20 guitars. My father was a fantastic guitarist, and this Danelectro here was his last possession. This was his only prized possession he had in his Seattle Housing Authority apartment that he died in 20 days after my little boy was born. My little boy was born January 20th, 2020. My father, his grandfather, died 20 days later, February 9th, 2020. You know, I remember when I got the call that he had passed in his Seattle Housing Authority apartment off Rainier in South Seattle. You know, he died in squalor. The Seattle Housing Authority takes people's Social Security money and lets them die in squalor in their buildings. The vast majority of substantial narcotics dealers I had in Seattle were living in Seattle Housing Authority buildings. Seattle's all down with letting people die on narcotics. They're all good with that there. Apparently it's compassion out there, letting people shoot fentanyl in tents on the side of the highway. It's compassionate, and letting people die in squalor, taking their social security money, it's compassionate. So this was what was left. You know, he had a stroke years before his life ended. He was living in the Close Inn Motel on Aurora, off 95th and Aurora. Close spelled with a K. When it was demolished, he ended up homeless again. I took him to his social worker. I really tried to get him back into housing. He didn't want to. He didn't want to. You know, on top of his alcoholism, he had a deep depression as well. You know, and that's what drove it. I asked him one time why he drank, and he told me it was because he was in pain. So I watched alcohol destroy my father. And every time I pick up a beer, I think about that. And then I continue to consume it in the hopes that it will numb that pain that I feel. Pain that alcohol caused in the first place. So I've been thinking a lot about my father today. And I am very similar to him in many ways. Even though he was not involved raising me, I guess I picked up a lot of his genetics because I got his love for guitar and math, and I look like him. And it terrifies me because he, you know, I don't know what chance I have, you know, knowing the way that he went out. You know, he was smarter and more capable than me, more educated, but he also was not as willing to look at himself emotionally, I believe. And I think that's where we differ as men. I'm more willing and capable to really look at what's going on with me. So when I met him at the Sunlight Cafe, first time I seen him in 10 years, he's drinking, I'm strung out on heroin. I say, "Hey Dad, can I come move in with you?" He said, "Sure, why not?" He's living in an apartment off 125th and Lake City Way. It was essentially a vintage guitar showroom. He had 25 beautiful vintage guitars. Gretsch's, Guilds, Fenders, Silvertones, truly vintage guitars. Vox AC30s. He had a cool collection of stuff. You know, he was producing art, and he was just drinking alone. So we basically went down the tubes together. Long story short, all of a sudden, there we are in this apartment. He's drinking again. My heroin use is increasing. You know, I was still kind of managing to hide the fact I was doing heroin. No one said anything anyways, so I don't know. We ended up getting evicted from that apartment. You know, the sheriff had to come remove him. He pawned all of those guitars for a fraction of the value. And he proceeded to be homeless for years. Alcoholic on the streets. This was the first time around he was homeless. I'm having a hard time staying linear here, but met him at 22. We moved in together. A year later, we were evicted. I went to treatment. I ended up in treatment. I was homeless. I was supporting my habits, stealing from Whole Foods. I was feeding myself at Whole Foods. You know, shout out Whole Foods. You guys did a good job feeding me and supporting my heroin habit. I'd go in there every other day and I'd steal a stack of their Putumayo world music CDs. You know, they were $20 new, and I'd take them down to Everyday Music on Broadway, and dude would buy them for $3 to $5 a pop. More world music, huh? Yeah, buddy, how much this time? Well, you know, I already got like 100 of them, so I'm gonna have to go a little lower this time, pal. Maybe try to get something else. But, you know, my heroin was right out on the street, so I was never a true thief. You know, I wasn't into boosting, going to the Macy's and taking $1,000 coats and whatnot. I was very petty. I took only what I needed, And I was able to get away with it for a long time because of that. I finally got arrested. I got cocky at the university bookstore and tried to take a few Lord of the Rings box sets, and they got me. And I had syringes on me, and I was getting ready to run, and then I thought to myself, you know what? This is a perfect opportunity to get me out of this. I hoped they would take me to jail. They did not. They released me with my syringes, and I think I walked up to the Whole Foods on 65th from that university bookstore in the Ave and stole some Putumayo World music CDs, and I wasn't homeless for too long living that way before I got into King County Detox. I knew that was not how I wanted to live. The first time at King County Detox down in the South End, I only made it 3 days. I took $15 with me, which is exactly what it cost to get a quarter piece of heroin. That's what it used to cost anyways, back in the early 2000s. And so day 3, you know, even though I was on all the Librium and all the pills they gave me, I wasn't hacking it. And I made up some ridiculous story about my grandma dying and I had to leave. And, I left AMA. They had to hold me for a few hours because they'd just given me the Librium and they knew what was going on. And I left there and I overdosed on Broadway, not like ended up in the hospital style, but I came to in a stoop on Capitol Hill and someone had stolen my hat. And so I was back in King County Detox a few weeks later, and that time I made it. I was there for 4 weeks, and they got me into Thunderbird Treatment Center in South Seattle. I stayed there for 3 months, and then I moved into an Oxford house and stayed there for a year. And within that year, I returned to school. I was working. I learned how to become a responsible adult. I met my now wife. I put an immense amount together for myself in those 18 months of pure sobriety. However, I continue to have crippling cravings for heroin. They did not go away. I was working the steps, I was doing everything I was supposed to be doing, and I continued to have just debilitating cravings for heroin where I would have to go into the bathroom at work and just dig my fingernails into my head, fighting the craving to go to Broadway and get heroin. And I ultimately relapsed, and I ended up, and throughout this time, my dad's like living in abandoned houses in Northgate on the streets. He's getting beat up in parks in Lake City. And, finally he got in touch with a social worker and they looked at his records. They're like, you've worked all of these years. You're eligible for Social Security funds, man. And so they got him that. And, that money helped him get back indoors, but it also gave him just enough to drink himself to death, basically. And after he had that stroke in the close-in motel on Aurora, I went over to see him one day and he wasn't there. And he never went anywhere except to the store, so I knew something was wrong. And I called a few hospitals. Sure enough, I found him there. And his right side didn't work anymore. He couldn't play guitar anymore. The first thing he was reteaching himself how to do when I took him home was how to crack open a beer and light a cigarette. It wasn't just the alcohol that killed him, it was the cigarettes. He was a chain smoker. This guy would just chain Pall Malls back, 2-3 packs a day, that kind of smoker. His guitars were, all of his pieces were cigarette pieces. All of his flaws aside, his alcoholism, his depression, he was a brilliant man. He was a brilliant man. He was an amazing musician. He was a very skilled mathematician. He was a skilled software developer. He was an amazing artist. He was a very sensitive man. And like he told me, he just wanted to kill his pain. And the last many years of his life were very, very rough. And for a lot of that, I was his caretaker. And that built a lot of resentment in me because he was not there to care for me, but I was there to care for him. And it got to a point where I knew if I stayed in Seattle, I was going to die. I could not. I just, I got in too deep. I got in too deep. You know, I was walking this tight wire where I know all these underworld drug cats, but then I know all these people into holistic health. You know, acupuncturists, therapists, um, you know, all of that really conscious, healthy living type stuff. I knew all of those people, and you know, pretty soon these people start to figure out I'm relapsing on heroin more and more, and pretty soon they don't want anything to do with me. And, you know, being around people that are on dope sucks. I can say that myself, having been sober and worked in Ibogaine clinics and dealing with people who are actively strung out. It's rough, man. And anyway, so you know, on this Christmas, I'm thinking about my dad a lot, and I know he's looking down, smiling and happy that I'm playing his guitar and I'm present for my son in a way that he was not capable of being present for me. And it feels like an insurmountable weight to feel as though I'm responsible to break that pattern. But that's what my goal is here, is to break that pattern of self-loathe and drug addiction, alcoholism, and conscious self-destruction. So I'm going to keep this thing moving. I'm not going to drink tomorrow, as I usually do on the fourth day, because all this stuff starts coming out. And it's too much, and I don't want to feel it. I think it's too much anyways. Anyways, Merry Christmas. Thank you. Love you all. Bye-bye.